Welcome to the Political Institutions and Political Economy PIPE Workshop at the Bedrosian Center here in the Price School at the University of Southern California. I'm Jeff Jenkins, the director of the Bedrosian Center and the PIPE Collaborative. Our workshop speaker today is Michael Andrews. Mike is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow in innovation policy at the National Bureau of Economic Research and in the economics department at Northwestern University. His research interests include economic history, economics of innovation, and entrepreneurship. His published work has appeared in Regional Science and Urban Economics and Exploration in Economic History. His presentation today is entitled Bar Talk: Informal Social Interactions, Alcohol Prohibition, and Invention. Following the presentation, we'll have a formal discussant, Maxwell Palmer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston University, to provide some comments. During Professor Andrews' talk, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat or Q&A box. I'll be monitoring questions as the talk goes on. And without further ado, I give you Professor Michael Andrews.
Jeff, thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. It's absolutely a pleasure to talk to you all here today. If you can't see my screen or anything, or you can't hear me at any point, please let me know. For those of you I don't know, who I suspect is most of you, as Jeff said, I'm Mike Andrews at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And the sort of really big picture things I'm interested in is trying to understand, where do new ideas come from? Why are some people, places, groups so much more innovative than others? And what's the role of policy in either promoting innovation or, as perhaps we'll see today, maybe unintentionally decreasing rates of innovation? What we're going to talk about today is social interactions and innovation. So this idea that to get new ideas, you recombine old ideas, and to do that, you need to have social interactions. That's a very old idea in economics. It dates back at least to Alfred Marshall. Of course, it appears in other fields as well. So, Jane Jacobs, the famed urbanist, probably deserves a shout out here for recognizing the role of cities in facilitating interactions and recombinations of ideas. While we've known these ideas are likely true, that social interactions are likely important for the creation of new ideas for a long time, it's really just been the last few years that we've had the data and the methodological tools to start to really test these in sort of a rigorous way. So I think a lot of our examinations of the role of social interactions in innovation have been at either what I would call a fairly large macro level. So we know, for instance, that on a per capita basis, cities are much more innovative than more rural areas. Or we've been able to study social interactions that take place in a workplace, in the office. I think there's a lot of questions about, more broadly, the social interactions that take place outside of the workplace, what I call informal social interactions that tend to be a lot harder to observe in our data, but account for a really large share of the ideas we see and are exposed to each and every day. So that's what I want to think about in this paper. Before I get into it, let me maybe walk through an example just to fix ideas. So this is the Oasis Bar and Grill. Actually, it closed its doors about a year and a half ago for the last time. But the Oasis Bar and Grill was in Menlo Park, California. It's fairly famous as far as bars and grills go, as the home away from home of the Homebrew Computer Club. So if those of you know your computer history quite well, you may recognize the Homebrew Computer Club. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that the Homebrew Club really played a large role in launching the PC industry as we know it today. Steve Wozniak, for instance, was among their members. And how the Homebrew Club would operate is they would have basically formal or semi-formal seminars on the Stanford University campus. And then after the seminars, they'd go out to the parking lot and trade computer equipment out of the trunks of their cars. And then they would head over to the Oasis where the conversation would continue. So if you think about the kinds of conversations that happen at the Oasis in contrast to the seminar on campus, at the bar, there's no formal agenda. There's nobody taking a role other than maybe a literal bouncer. There's really no gatekeepers. You can easily bounce from conversation to conversation. So there's a lot of reasons to think that the kinds of knowledge flows that go on in this sort of informal setting might be particularly conducive to formulating new ideas. So that's what we want to think about in this paper today. While we think these kinds of settings might be important for forming new ideas, it's pretty hard to actually test. It's hard to quantify. And I've talked about a couple of these reasons already. First of all, the kinds of knowledge flows, the kinds of interactions that take place at some place like a coffee shop or a bar, someplace like the Oasis, these are almost by definition difficult to observe. Right? I usually can't see who's going into the bar at the same time, and I certainly can't see who's talking to whom once they get there or what they're talking about. I think maybe even more fundamentally, we have a challenge of endogeneity in that people choose who they interact with. So just because I see two PC hobbyists go into the Oasis and have a beer together, and then they come out and they both invent, a new improvement to the PC, that doesn't mean that the conversation in the Oasis caused them to be creative, right? People with similar interests are probably going to talk to one another. So we need to think about how to overcome this issue as well. The third point I want to make, and people like me who spend a lot of time thinking about innovation, I think sometimes we overlook this. But if we look at the entire population, innovation is relatively rare, at least innovation that is sort of important enough in expected value to justify, expending resources to develop it. So if we actually want to think about manipulating how people interact and seeing if that has an effect on innovation, we need to either study a population of people that's at high risk of innovating. That's what a lot of the literature does, examining, for instance, scientists, what happens if you change interactions between scientists. But if we want to think about the broader population, because innovation is relatively rare, we're going to need a very large intervention. So in this paper, I hope to overcome all three of these challenges. More specifically, what I'm going to do is look at a massive and involuntary disruption of informal social interactions from US history. So what I'm going to look at, of course, is alcohol prohibition. The idea behind this paper is fairly simple, actually. The idea is that prior to alcohol prohibition, the saloon was a really important social hub, really important social place for the life of the community in which people would interact. There's a large share of the population spent a non-trivial amount of their non-working hours at the saloon, so accounted for a certainly non-trivial share of their social interactions. And then the idea is with prohibition, the state comes in and tells people, look, you've got to find some other place, some other venue in which to interact. So we have a dramatic disruption of people's informal social networks and the ways in which people are informally interacting caused by prohibition. And what's nice, because these prohibition laws, first of all, are a massive intervention, change a lot of social interactions, but also stay on the books for a long time, we can observe, first of all, how the creation of new ideas, we'll proxy this by looking at Invention, how the creation of new ideas changes immediately after the law goes into effect, but also how people respond to these laws over time and rebuild their informal social networks. Okay. More specifically for this paper, what I'm going to look at is state prohibition laws. So I think a lot of us are probably familiar with federal alcohol prohibition, which goes into effect, depending on how you count, around 1920. But prior to that, there were actually multiple waves of states passing their own prohibition laws. And prior to that, counties could decide for themselves whether they wanted to allow the saloon or not. So the idea behind this paper is by using state laws, first of all, we get a great deal of geographic and temporal variation in terms of where these prohibition laws go into effect. But also, once a state law goes into effect, I can compare counties within a state on the basis of their pre-existing laws. And then a new law is going to differentially treat counties that were already wet relative to those that were already dry. We should see little effect on places that were already dry and a massive change in social interactions in the places that were wet. I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, the experimental design, as I get into it. Just a quick preview of what I find. I find that imposing alcohol prohibition causes a decline in patenting of about 12 to 15%. So that's a large, obviously a large decrease in patenting, a large effect from disrupting these informal social interactions. This drop is going to be biggest in the years that immediately follow prohibition, and then it's going to rebound over time. And that's exactly what we should expect to see if we have in mind a model where people are dynamically forming these social networks over time. So when the old network is forced to change because of alcohol prohibition, slowly it gets rebuilt. And I'll spend a fair amount of time today and a lot of page space in the paper arguing that this effect we see, this drop we see, is indeed caused by a disruption of informal interactions instead of any of the other myriad things you think could also be caused by prohibition. And then to me, what is possibly most interesting about this project, although maybe the most speculative as well, we can use the imposition of prohibition to start to draw some conclusions about, first of all, why are these informal social networks so important? And also, how resilient are they? In other words, as people are rebuilding these social networks, as we see patenting fall and then recover over time, are people interacting with their same old friends, but in a new location? Or are they meeting with new people, potentially being exposed to new ideas and creating new things? So the takeaway from all this is that disrupting how individuals interact has a large but reasonably short-lived effect on the rate of inventive activity. But we are going to see lasting changes in the structure of these social networks. So there appears to be a lasting effect on the direction of innovation. Okay, let's jump right in. Before getting into the historical setting, I like to always begin by, first of all, arguing that this idea that bars and saloons, I'll use those terms synonymously throughout the talk, the saloon or the bar really was an important social gathering place where ideas could pass from person to person, leading to new recombinations and leading to new ideas. So I think one thing, just sort of to get some face credibility here, is to show you that there's actually a large number of important ideas that were at least first articulated in settings like a bar. So everything from the first electronic digital computer, which Denisov sketched down on a napkin on a roadhouse on a trip back up the Mississippi River, to MRI machines, the idea for Southwest Airlines, perhaps most importantly, Discovery Channel's Shark Week. And this is far from an exhaustive list. Now, in the past, I think the saloon was even more important as a social center and a social hub than the bar is today. Another point I want to make is that this idea that places where people can get together and share food and drink, the fact that those places might be so important for leading to the spreading and creation of new ideas, this isn't unique to me. So there's a number of people, a number of scholars have pointed to the spread of the coffee houses during in England in the years that predated the Enlightenment as a cause of the diffusion and creation of new ideas during the Enlightenment, eventually facilitating the Industrial Revolution. Now, in the US, this culture of coffee houses or tea houses never quite caught on in the same way it did in Europe. In fact, I'd argue that the US maybe had sort of a contentious relationship with caffeinated beverages. So this is, of course, the Boston Tea Party. And, there was this view throughout early American history that the coffee house was this sort of pretentious or effeminate European institution. Instead, if you wanted to be a real American, you'd go to the tavern, which became the saloon, which became the bar. In fact, this social role really was filled by the bar, and the American Revolution in many places was literally plotted out of places like the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston and many other similar locations across the country. Okay. Why was the saloon so important as a social gathering place? Well, it filled a number of roles beyond simply serving drinks. So often saloons were the first places travelers would stop when people arrived in town. They'd provide mailing addresses for new residents, provide access to newspapers. They often had the first public telephones. So if you look at these first 4 bullet points here, what this is telling us is when a new idea is arriving into a location, whether it comes wrapped up as a person or written down or electronically over a telephone or telegraph wire, it's often coming to the saloon first. A lot of times saloons have the only public washroom. So if you've ever had an office close to a bathroom, you know what kind of foot traffic that can generate and the kind of conversations that sometimes spawn out of that. And of course, the post-workday happy hour is not a recent invention. One other point I want to make is that in the period before alcohol prohibition, it's exactly the people who were most likely to frequent the saloons who were also the people who were most likely to become inventors. So today we think about people who are likely to patent or innovate. We probably think of professional scientists or engineers. I've done a fair amount of work in U.S. history linking patent records to historical decennial census records. And you can actually see what the occupation of most of our inventors was and how it changes over time. And during the period we're going to be looking at, most of our inventors are what I would call skilled craftspeople or maybe skilled blue-collar workers. So mechanics, plumbers, things like that. These are also the people we'd expect to find in the saloon. And we know this because we can look at the names of several saloons. You see places like the Mechanics Exchange, the Stonecutters Exchange. It's hard to see here, but this is actually called the Working Men's Exchange, this bar and saloon in this picture here. So it's exactly the people who were frequenting these institutions that we expect to be coming up with a lot of the ideas that make it into the patent record. Okay. A final point I'll make before getting into the empirical setting is that this idea that saloons in particular might be particularly important for facilitating the flow and recombinations of ideas. This isn't something that modern day researchers have thought about. This was actually, it's not solely that. It's also something that was recognized by contemporaries at the time. So this is a quote from Moore in the American Journal of Sociology. I believe this is volume 3 of AJS. And what Moore says is the social stimulus is epitomized in the saloon. It's the center of learning, books, lecture hall. And it's okay that there's no skilled teachers in the bar because the people are teaching themselves through their interactions. This is a quote from Jack London from his semi-autobiographical novel, John Barleycorn. Jack London, as some of you may know, was somebody who had a complicated relationship with the bottle. And what London writes is that always when men came together to exchange ideas, they did so over alcohol. The saloon was the place of congregation. Men gathered to it as primitive men gathered about the fire. And finally, this last quote is from G.K. Chesterton, British author. He'd actually just come back from a trip of the U.S. and was writing about his experience. This quote's a little bit later, so this occurs during federal prohibition. And if you look at newspapers from the time, you'll see a lot of people saying that the potential downsides of prohibition were changing how people interacted. It wasn't really a big deal because the saloon was on the way out anyway to be replaced by this new thing called the cinema. And Chesterton says the cinema boasts of being a substitute for the tavern, but I think it's a very bad substitute. Nobody enjoys cinemas more than I do, but to enjoy them, a person has only to look and not even to listen. And in a tavern, he has to talk, right? So I think this is really underscoring this idea that in these social places, in places like the saloon, one of the things that happened was communication, was sharing and recombining ideas. So let's pivot from there and let's talk about the Prohibition movement in U.S. history. So this is going to be a one-slide history of Prohibition. Of course, it's a fascinating event. We could spend hours and hours talking about it. This, by the way, is Carrie Nation. The quote here says, she says, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet." This is a picture of a recent hatchetation where Carrie Nation would go around and literally chop up bars. And this is occurring exactly during the time period that I'll be studying in this paper. So the kind of last decade of the 19th century and then first decade and a half or 2 decades of the 20th century. That's getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's think a bigger picture. Throughout U.S. history, counties have always had jurisdiction to determine their own alcohol rules. And, for certain periods of time, this was known as the local option. Makes sense. Localities could determine for themselves whether or not they wanted to allow the bar. At several periods in U.S. history, but particularly in the late 19th century, many states close to the same time are going to decide to pass prohibition laws of their own. And the nice thing about this is that when states are passing their laws, counties now are going to be differentially treated depending on the local option, right, or the pre-existing local alcohol rules. And finally, this all culminates in federal prohibition. Around 1900, I put a little asterisk here because, of course, the Prohibition Amendment went into effect in 1920. but there was de facto prohibition as a result of World War I. So how we think about what's going on around those World War I years is potentially going to be important. So everything I'm going to show you in this talk today is going to be robust to just excluding everything that happens after 1917. Okay. Where does the data come from? State prohibition laws, of course, it's fairly easy to find data on when states pass particular laws. Michael Lewis has been very generous in providing some data on not just when did laws pass, but also how did individual counties vote within these prohibition referenda. And then the real key that we need to think about prohibition is something about county level prohibition data, county level prohibition status, and how this changes over time. So for this, I rely on data by Seacrest from 2012, really phenomenal work from a large number of sources trying to figure out every county in the US, when were they wet, when were they dry. Now, in thinking about the sort of research design here, we know when individual counties decided to become dry or stay wet, and we know when state laws went into effect. I think we should probably have some concern or some skepticism that, state laws don't just happen randomly, right? There's underlying changes in social and cultural views that are happening among people who live in counties within that state, who then are going to, vote or lobby their representatives to change the state law. So what should concern us is if we think there's these underlying changes in social and cultural views, which are correlated both with a county prohibition status or the presence of a state prohibition law, that might also be correlated with invention, right? So there's a large literature that social openness, openness to new ideas, very correlated with religious conservatism. And we know that's also related to localities' views towards alcohol. So to try and overcome these issues, what I'm going to do in my baseline sample is look only at counties that were either consistently wet or consistently dry for extended periods of time prior to the passage of state prohibition laws. So the idea here is that you have a county that every single year has the opportunity to change its local laws, and it doesn't do it. It probably has fairly constant views towards alcohol. And then the other thing I can do, relying on this data from Lewis, is look at state prohibition laws that were passed by referendum and keep in my baseline sample counties that were consistently wet and voted to remain wet, and compare these to places that were consistently dry and voted to remain dry. So in other words, in this baseline sample, what I'm doing is excluding these swing counties, which we think are probably undergoing dramatic changes in their views towards alcohol in the background. So we want to, again, keep places that we think have consistent views towards alcohol and hence fairly consistent views towards social openness and innovation. One upshot of this is we lose a lot of the data. This is a map of what makes it into our baseline sample. If you sort of change your restrictions on terms of how long do we require these places to be consistently wet or consistently dry, you can get a bigger or smaller sample. Results are actually going to be remarkably consistent when we change the sample in different ways. But this is what our baseline sample is going to look like. You might also think, these wet counties and these dry counties are probably very different places. That might be true. Actually, that's okay for us as long as they're different in consistent ways, which will difference out in our difference in differences setup. But actually, what I want to show you in this table is that the wet and dry counties in my sample are, I think, surprisingly similar. So when we think about places that are famously wet, we think, Baltimore, where I am now, or Chicago, or New York City. A lot of these famously wet cities that we think about when we think about the Prohibition era are in states that do not pass local prohibition laws. So they're not going to show up in my sample. So if I just look at the sample states, for most things, wet counties and dry counties tend to be quite similar. And then if I include state fixed effects, so now I compare just wet counties to dry counties within the same state, they're actually very similar. Even the F statistics can't reject that these things combined do not predict whether or not a county will be wet or not. So, again, it's okay if there's differences between wet and dry counties, but in our sample within states, these places actually appear to be quite similar. I should talk a little bit about the patent data. I'll spend just a couple minutes on this, although I could talk much longer. I really like historical patent data. Patent data today is fairly easy to come by. It's been digitized by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office since 1976. For historical patents, we have these image files, but actually getting the patent data from this is not so trivial. Image quality can vary dramatically. Optical character recognition, different approaches to that have led to very different patent data sets. What I'm going to use here is a very nice data set of historical patent data called the HISPAT data, put together by Sergio Petralia and co-authors. And what we have in HISPAT is inventor names, inventor locations, and dates. And I'll pull in from some other sources additional information about patents as needed. Names and locations and dates are, of course, going to be crucial because I need to locate a patent in each county and determine whether that patent comes from a county that's wet or dry. So this is what our data looks like. This is just plotting patenting in wet counties, patenting in dry counties. Year 0 is going to be the year that state prohibition laws go into effect. And you can see it looks like there's something fairly dramatic that happens just to the wet counties in the years after prohibition. And we're going to look at that much more. In particular, this is the baseline regression specification I'll look at. This is just a basic two-way fixed effect model. We're going to look at patenting in the wet counties relative to the dry counties before and after a statewide prohibition law goes into effect. And this is what I see. So patenting drops in the wet counties relative to the dry counties by about 12% after the passage of these state prohibition laws or after the implementation of these state prohibition laws. We could also, instead of just looking at changes in the level of patenting, we could look at patenting rates. And that falls here by about 0.4 patents per 100,000 people. This is about a 15% drop. So in the previous slide, I said 12 to 15%. That range is just coming from these point estimates depending on the specification we look at. We could also estimate a dynamic diff and diff. This is what we see. I think this is not surprising given the raw data we just looked at. We don't see any evidence of differential pre-trends. And then we see a drop, which is large right away, fairly quickly. The first full year that prohibition goes into effect is year 0. So we see a large drop and then basically gradual recovery. By the time we get to 4 or 5 years after the prohibition law has gone into effect, we actually can't reject that prohibition has returned to its previous level, previous difference between the wet and dry counties. And this, as I said, is robust to a lot of things. We can throw out anything happening around World War I or after. This is not driven by either counties with large cities or only very rural areas. We get fairly consistent results, cutting the sample and looking at either big or small places by population. It's robust to a lot of alternative specifications. One thing I will show you that I like quite a bit is what I call these placebo tests. So one thing we can do is look at places where prohibition referenda were brought up for a vote, but they failed. So this is telling us that it's not just, and of course, when that happens, we see no effect, or basically nothing. This is telling us that it's not the fact that there was statewide sentiment towards prohibition, was really the fact that the laws passed and something changed after they went into effect. We can also look at places that passed anti-drinking measures, such as temperance education laws, but not prohibition. And again, we don't see any effect. And it's not just that large progressive era policies that change things matter. We can look at passage of women's suffrage laws, compulsory schooling laws, income tax laws, and at least over the relatively short time windows we're looking at in this study, none of these things appear to differentially affect counties either. So it really does appear to be something unique to prohibition. Prohibition laws actually going into effect. So why should we think that what we see, these changes in patenting that we see, are being driven by disruptions of social interactions? I think there's a number of things we can look at that sort of suggest that what we're seeing really is changes in how people talk to one another, causing changes in patenting behavior. So one thing we can do is very simply look at collaboration patterns. So I can see the number of patents where people are collaborating, where both inventors live in the same county, drops by about 8%. If I look at patents where people collaborate and live in different locations, either different towns, different counties, different states, I see really no effect. So it's these localized collaborations, exactly the kinds of things you expect to occur as a result of kinds of conversations that take place in the saloon, that are going to drop. We can also see that patenting declines most by the people who we would expect to be more affected by the closing of the saloon. So what do I mean by that? One thing we can look at is patenting by men versus patenting by women. Prior to Prohibition, the saloon was basically the domain of men. Women typically were not welcome. And indeed, we see drops in patenting by men, basically nothing by women. This is just within the wet counties. So even if you're not convinced by my comparison of wet counties to dry counties, we can just look within the wet counties and we see changes in patterns of patenting only for the groups that we'd expect to be affected by the saloon. And this is a similar idea. This is like a triple difference where we're looking at the difference between male and female patenting in the wet counties here and the dry counties here. And again, you see this difference shrinks much more in the wet counties. I should also mention, by the way, some of my other work that I mentioned before, linking patentees to the census, we can actually quantify how many patents come from women. That's not so trivial to do. You might think that this graph doesn't tell you much because women just didn't patent historically. That's actually not the case. So depending on exactly what year we look at, women account for 5 to 10% of all patents. So not a lot, unfortunately, but also not trivial. We can also rule out some other explanations. So you might think that after Prohibition, maybe there's a general economic downturn in an area that gets affected. This is actually hard to look at. We don't have like great data about local economic conditions at anything close to a yearly frequency historically. One thing I've done is tried to collect some city directories. So you can look at business closures in cities in wet counties relative to dry counties. And, other than the saloons, which all closed their doors after Prohibition, there's no evidence that there's any more business closures or business failures after Prohibition. It's not driven by a drop in just alcohol-related patenting. So we can throw out patents in classes related to alcohol or bottling and canning or anything like that. That's not driving the effects we see. It doesn't appear to be explained by migration patterns, right? You might worry that when Prohibition goes into effect, the people who really like the saloon just pack up and move. This is hard to see on sort of the yearly frequency like our patenting data is, because we only get population at the level of decadal population censuses. But you can look at the next census after the state prohibition laws, and the levels of population are no different. The difference in levels of population is no different after the prohibition law goes into effect. And you can also look at gross flows. So it's not like people who like the saloons leave the formerly wet counties and are replaced by people who like living in a dry county. There's no difference in the either out migrants or in migrants either. We can think about some stories like organized crime or health from drinking bad moonshine. I would expect a lot of these stories to see increasing effects over time as organized crime gets organized. And again, we can look at the dynamics of our treatment effect where we see this sharp drop and then a recovery. And we don't see sort of effects that get larger over time as we'd expect with some of these other stories. So I think everything here is quite consistent with what we see being driven by the change in how social interactions happen after the saloons close. One other explanation I should mention is whether this is driven by social interactions or something to do with alcohol itself, right? It could be the case that alcohol just makes people more creative. There's sort of a debate in the pharmacology literature on this. I don't take a particular stand one way or another, but it's at least plausible. So how can we think about this? There's, of course, no great measures out there for changes in alcohol consumption when it was illegal. there's some proxies. So I do really two things to think about this. One is we can look at variation in the type of state prohibition laws. So every state alcohol prohibition law is going to be an anti-saloon law. It's going to shut down the bars. Some states, however, are also going to pass what are called bone dry laws, which are going to make it illegal not just to have a saloon, but also to sell, manufacture, transport alcoholic beverages. So if we think this is really a story about alcohol consumption, I think we'd expect to see bigger drops in patenting in places that pass bone dry laws. And that's not what we see. There's no detectable difference in states that adopt one type of law versus the other. We can also try and proxy for changes in alcohol consumption using things like cirrhosis of the liver death rates, which Jeff Mirren and Angela Dills have looked at in some of their papers. And, including things like controls for cirrhosis rates doesn't affect our results at all. So as best as we can measure, this doesn't appear to be a result of changes in alcohol consumption. It really does appear to be changes in how people interact. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about today is this question of how resilient are informal social networks to shocks, or in the case of alcohol prohibition, we're radically disrupting how people organize their social networks. So what we want to think about is, as patenting recovers, are individuals interacting with the same people, but in new places, right? So we eventually figure out where the speakeasy is and all of my buddies start to go and drink together again. Or do I interact with new people and potentially become exposed to new ideas? So how can we think about this? First of all, what I've done here, this is just our baseline results again. But what I've done is split this up into the first 3 years after Prohibition and then the next 3 years. So this is capturing exactly what we saw in the dynamic diff and diff, right? We see this initial large drop. And then by the time we get to a few years out, we can no longer reject that patenting in the wet counties is differentially low relative to the baseline. So this is, think about this as just a baseline to fix ideas and remember what we saw before. What I'm going to do next is look at how does patenting change for pairs of inventors, right? Patents that have two inventors on the basis of whether inventors have collaborated together before or not. So what I'm going to do is look at all of the pairs of names that have shown up on the same patent prior to Prohibition. And in the wet counties after Prohibition, we see a large drop in those patents, a 12% decline in patenting by people who have collaborated together in the past. If we look 3 more years out, I still see a decline of roughly the same magnitude. So people who used to collaborate together patent together much less in these formerly wet counties, and that never recovers. On the other hand, I can also look at people who are novel collaborations, people who never collaborated together in the past. I see perhaps a small decline of about 5 or 6% in the years immediately after Prohibition. But then by the time we get to a few years out, again, I can't reject that we're back to where we were. So it's not that collaboration stops after we shut down the bar, but these existing collaborations decline and never appear to come back, at least not over those first 6 years that I'm looking at. I can also think about whether when you're interacting with new people, does this cause you to create new things? So there's a lot of ways one could think about looking at this. What I do here is for each county, I'm looking at what's the most common patent technology class that was patented in that technology prior to Prohibition. And then we can see if this patenting in that particular class change after Prohibition goes into effect. What we can see is people patenting the same technologies less often after Prohibition goes into effect in the wet counties relative to the dry counties. And once again, we see no recovery. So the way I sort of think about this is, I think this is suggestive evidence that what we know and what new ideas we come up with is determined by where we go and who we talk to when we go there, right? So we see people collaborating with different people and less likely to be working on the same whole. Or in other words, we see fairly persistent, at least over 6-year window or so, fairly persistent effects on the structure of these informal social networks and hence on the direction of invention. There's some other lessons we can draw and things I look at in paper and in the appendix. You can see that prohibition has less of an effect when there are substitutes for the saloon that are more readily available. So things like barber shops or, when the concentration of the population by religion is higher, so people are more likely to be going to the same churches. We see bigger drops for people with smaller numbers of initial patents, right? So people have well-established inventor networks already, maybe are able to continue those networks, among other things, which I won't get into here. I guess I'll mention this last point. We do see similar results in other settings. You can look at the passage of national prohibition, and you see similar drops. You can look at the expansion of brew pubs today. I don't think we have great empirical identification of the effects, but at least correlationally, places where they get more brew pubs see more patenting. And I have some other work on the expansion of coffee shops today, and we see similar effects. So this doesn't appear to be unique to prohibition. The more I and my co-authors look at settings where social interactions change, the more we seem to find that these informal interactions do indeed matter for the creation of the license. So I think maybe let me wrap up about now, just to sort of conclude and remind you of what we've seen. State alcohol prohibition laws reduced patenting by about 12 to 15% in the years immediately following prohibition. This drop is going to be largest in the years immediately after the law goes into effect, and then it's going to largely rebound within about 6 years. And it appears that this effect really is driven by a disruption of informal social interactions. As individuals respond to prohibition, they're going to be meeting with new people and producing different types of inventions. I don't see these effects reverse. So while the level of patenting falls and comes back, who I talk to and the kinds of things I come up with never revert to where they were before prohibition. So again, sort of my big takeaway here, how I think about these results is prohibition is going to cause a temporary but dramatic decline in the rate of inventive activity, but a lasting shift in the direction of invention and the structure of these social networks. And with that, I will stop here and turn it over to Jeff. Look forward to your questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. So as I said at the outset, we have a formal discussion for the paper today, and it's Max Palmer from Boston University.
So this is a really interesting paper, and I found it really exciting both in thinking about innovation and patents, an area which I really hadn't thought and learned that much about in the past, and certainly not an area I'd studied, and then thinking about prohibition as a historical era. And so I think most of my comments will be more on the second half, the historical context part. But briefly, this paper, and I just want to say it's a fantastic title, and I love that a couple of the section titles call back on this as well, including calling the conclusion closing time. I always appreciate a good title pun. The key question is asking about how informal social interactions affect invention and patents. And the core of the research design, there's many, many extensions here and a lot of really interesting robustness checks, is using state-level alcohol prohibition referenda to compare previously wet counties with already dry counties, especially wet counties that did not want to become dry. And I think this is a really interesting research design that captures this externally imposed prohibition and uses a rolling nature of this across different states at different times to try to get at the causal effect of the closing of saloons and other sort of third places that, as Mike talked about at the start, have a really important role in creating informal relationships and networks. The key results are that prohibition reduces new patents by 8 to 18% per year. And then that this is shifting social networks. It's going to change who collaborates with whom, the areas of innovation. We see a short-term dip in patents that gradually then seems to recover after a couple of years. This isn't some permanent change in innovation, but disrupting networks, we then get to see the immediate effect of that. This paper uses an incredible wealth of data. And I want to highlight a bunch of different historical data sets that are all coming together here beyond the patent data that Mike talked about a lot, and the prohibition referenda and laws in different places. There's data coming in on ethnic last names to look at different communities and how they might be differentially affected by the closing of saloons. Saloon substitutes like barbers, or I think you call it non-bartender restaurants, or clergy, all these different measures of other places we can gather where we might have informal networks that shouldn't get disrupted at all by prohibition. Historical city directories to build new indices of economic development and growth. Public health data that I had no clue existed for this era. And I'm sure I'm missing some in this list, but I wanted to call attention to bringing together such a wide range of data. And anyone who's done even a little bit of historical work knows that every single one of these data sets is hard to work with on its own. And bringing them all together at the county level over such a time span is a really impressive accomplishment itself. So it's something that's definitely worth thinking about and recognizing, and seeing what a wide range of historical economic data of different types we can get and apply to these kinds of questions. And these are used for a really interesting sequence of robustness checks. But I want to think a little bit about the framing of prohibition as a social movement and for a seminal event of the era. And there's sort of this common or dominant narrative about prohibition, that it's a conservative or reactionary, religious-driven movement. Sometimes thought about it sort of as a white lash against immigrant communities and minority communities, and sort of imposing prohibition on places that didn't want it. Sometimes maybe seen as a punishment for drinking. But there's also another narrative about it, and this has been really well developed and advanced in a recent book by Mark Schrad about temperance as a global movement, and thinking about it not as a conservative reactionary movement, but instead one of marginalized people fighting against a corrupt and extractive industry and the politics that were tied to it. And this puts it in sort of a global context. American prohibition is happening amidst a global temperance movement in many different countries. And it's much more about fighting against the consequences of addiction and the economic power of the liquor machine, as Schrad calls it, that is using the manufacture of cheap and really strong alcohol to create addictions and to extract a lot of money out of communities with a lot of negative effects. And so I think that a lot of recent historical work frames the movement as more conservative, as this necessary, sort of as a failure, right? We see sort of prohibition seen widely as a failure in the US. But there's an argument to be made that there were some real benefits to it for some communities at the time. And I think this paper says something interesting about the effects of prohibition in an area that I've never seen considered by any other scholars of this era. We're seeing an effect of prohibition not on alcohol, not on sort of individual wealth, at least not directly, but on innovation and development and new technology. And the losing of places, I think, is an area that prohibition needs to be studied more in prohibition. I think you quote some places in the introduction of the paper and in your presentation about bars being a key third place, both then and now. But this really clear loss, I don't think is well articulated in how we think about prohibition. It's much more these places that were seen as, sucking a lot of wealth out of communities, a place where men were spending a lot of money and depriving their families. Instead, we're seeing it as a place that's not necessarily alcohol-centered and providing a real tangible value to people in saloons and to their families and communities. So I think there's something interesting to say about saloons and how that speaks to the prohibition movement as a whole. I think a lot of your robustness checks also have that value in showing that it doesn't seem to be driven by alcohol, right? You look at on the public health side, thinking about those effects, thinking of the differential effects when you compare across different communities, that is really losing this place is a different consequence of prohibition and a different sort of view on who gets affected by it than we might have seen before in some of this. And I think can speak to some of these debates about who really are the beneficiaries of prohibition. And I just want to point to a couple small places I'd like to see for sort of development as you continue to work on this paper. First, as someone who's not coming from the patent innovation side, I'd love just to see a little bit more about patents. And in particular, I'd love to see a couple examples of patents that you think are the kinds of things that were developed in saloons versus the kinds of things maybe in the exact same places in time that weren't. So, here's one where it's a team of, 2 or 3 different people who seem unrelated. The kinds of things that we think are getting worked on there, I think to give us a sense of the kind of development and progress that's happening in saloons that's not happening in neighboring businesses. Just, it's not essential for any of your empirical results, but just to give us a better sense of what's in this data and the kind of phenomena you're observing. I also wonder if the end of national prohibition gives you another venue to look at, and that might be a different paper. It might not be this paper, but thinking about national prohibition ends and we still have state level prohibitions, we still have dry counties. Do we see that at least as a new disruption to social networks, or at least a new opening for third places? Speakeasies go back to being, bars and saloons and all. How does that disruption to social networks either change what gets developed in newly wet counties compared to the ones that stay dry the whole time? There might be some way to exploit that in similar ways. And then finally, I know there's been a lot of advances in the difference in difference and two-way fixed effects literatures over the last year, since you wrote this paper. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how some of those concerns we might have about two-way fixed effects, in particular, how that might affect the results you see here and how you're dealing with some of that. But this is a really great, interesting paper. I loved reading it. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Max. Mike, did you want to respond to anything that Max brought up?
I think the first thing I want to say is thank you very much. I really appreciate the comments. They were thoughtful. I always love it to hear that somebody likes all the drinking puns that I tried to insert in the paper. I'll sort of respond maybe in reverse order. Starting, I guess, with the advances in diff and diff. As Max said, there's a couple of revolutions that have taken place since the most recent draft, I guess, got posted. Everything's robust to some of these new methods, I should say. It didn't make it into a new version of the paper yet. Not quite ready for prime time to circulate.
I'm not sure.
But it will soon.
Should we use advances here? The changes, maybe. No, it's tongue in cheek. I'm being funny, trying to be funny.
Yeah, point taken, actually. I think these recent developments, changes in the two-way fixed effects literature, I do think are particularly relevant here because one of the points I'm trying to make is that we have heterogeneous treatment effects over time. So we want to think pretty carefully about these things. And at least first couple passes, there's half dozen of these new estimators out there now, and I'm still, thinking through, when it's most appropriate to use which in which context. But, it appears that everything is similarly robust, maybe stronger after using some of these new methods. The end of Prohibition is also another very interesting thing to study. There's an early draft of this paper that actually did look at that. When I say early draft, this has been many years ago now. There was a positive effect after Prohibition ends. What I haven't done so much is look into the dynamics. And I think this is where things get really interesting when we sort of think about theoretical predictions. It's fairly clean when we impose Prohibition because those networks get disrupted right away. When you end Prohibition, when some places go wet again, the new saloons probably don't all reopen overnight. These networks sort of shift maybe more gradually. So I think the dynamics are a little bit less stark. So it's a little bit harder to think about things there. So I do think, I agree, that's probably a separate paper, something I would love to think about. And David Jackson, co-authors, have done a lot of work looking at the end of Prohibition, primarily on health effects, but there's been some literature on sort of the timing of when state laws get rolled back and things of that nature as well. You also mentioned some examples of patents that we think are emerged from conversations in the bar. Those would be helpful in the paper. I halfway agree. One of the beliefs I have, thinking about where my ideas have come from and, talking to other people and reading sort of biographies of ideas, I think in a lot of instances, we as creators of new ideas aren't sure where we get sort of the sources of inspiration from. You find several weeks later that sort of the pieces fit together in your head, but you couldn't trace back where all the components emerged. So that makes it very difficult to sort of trace back inventions to the saloon, because I think in a lot of cases, people, maybe didn't realize it was the conversation in the bar a few weeks ago that sort of spurred them to try one thing rather than another, and that thing worked. Or maybe there's some stigma about attributing my great new invention to the drunken conversation I had last month. So I think for all those reasons, it's tough to find examples. I would love to find some, but I think it's tricky to locate them. And I think even if they don't sort of show up in the historical record, I don't see that as dispositive for the fact that saloons played such a role. The last thing I'll respond to briefly, which I think I agree with, is this question about framing prohibition. I'm a big fan of the bar, so maybe I project a little bit, and it's hard not to view prohibition as a negative. But clearly, a lot of people wanted it for a lot of reasons. You hear horror stories about particularly mistreatment of women after the husband comes home after drinking all day, squandering the family finances, things like that. I don't want to say that there weren't good things to come out of prohibition. And things that made a vote for prohibition perfectly rational to the people who supported it. Nor do I think any of that sort of takes away from the effect that I see in this paper. So Max, I think I'm in complete agreement. I think one of the things that makes this study so interesting is, I think, effects on innovation, these sort of unintended effects of disrupting social networks, were indeed completely unintended. I don't think Wayne Wheeler was sitting at the headquarters of the Anti-Saloon League sort of cackling because he's going to set American innovation back. So really, I think an unexpected effect. And I think sort of maybe one of the bigger messages of this paper is, when we analyze policies, thinking more carefully about how does it change the social dimension or the interaction dimension too. And maybe that'll help us, I hope that'll help us think about these sort of unintended innovation results or other results that come from changing the way people interact. But overall messages, thank you. Appreciate it.
Any thoughts, Max, on anything here?
Two quick ones. On the prohibition side, I agree it doesn't take away anything from the paper. I think that I feel like prohibition was taught for a long time in that sort of history as written by the victors as this was a failed experiment. And I think there's been some good recent scholarship thinking about sort of the motives of prohibition and what it was attempting to do from the other perspective that are worth thinking about. And this is sort of top of mind for me as I was just reading Mark Lowenstraud's new book, Smashing the Liquor Machine, which is an excellent work of comparative politics that I recommend to everybody who's read about prohibition but never thought about it globally before. It's really an excellent book. That all the sort of the history you're citing, and I've done the same, in thinking of prohibition in the past, is all from the same sort of standard perspective of it. And it's sort of worth, I think, thinking about this other side that has really been understudied until recently. But it certainly doesn't undercut anything you're saying. I think it highlights sort of this really interesting consequence that nobody was expecting. And then just briefly on the examples, you have a robustness check where you're looking at places where two unrelated people are on a patent together, right? As sort of an example of things that we think are probably coming from informal interactions that way, and people meeting in some unexpected way. So maybe just one of those might be a good example. But I agree, you don't have to be able to provide lengthy examples to establish the effect.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. That's really doable.
Okay, I have a few thoughts and questions that I'll share here. Like Max, I was wondering, I'm not a student of patents. I wonder if you could give a very, very short overview of what the process is or was of getting a patent, what you would have to do.
Yeah. Try and keep this short. Actually, it can be quite short. Really, to get a patent, you have to write up a patent application and file it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, where it gets examined by an examiner. And if the examiner finds it to be novel and non-obvious, your patent will issue when it will be published and make it into the official patent record. And actually, I will just say, one of the unique things about U.S. history and U.S. patent law relative to the rest of the world is it tends to be remarkably democratic in the sense that the fees for obtaining a patent are substantially cheaper in the U.S. than anywhere else in the world, at least up through the middle of the 20th century. And we see invention coming from many different, people from all walks of life. It wasn't sort of just an activity for the very elite like it would have been in, early 1800s England, for instance.
Is there any reason? Well, let me ask this other question first. Is there anything like a state patent? I mean, are there only federal patents? Is there any substitute?
That's probably a trickier question than maybe you intended. Historically, there were U.S. patents, like during the Articles of Confederation and things like that. I'm not sure when they actually went off the books, but as soon as the federal patent law goes into effect, state patents effectively die. I'm not aware of anybody making use of state patents into the 20th century.
So, with the passage of Prohibition, actually, it would be even more interesting at the back end, I suppose, the elimination of Prohibition. Is there any reason to believe that a change in presidential administration mattered at all for that, and the people who are staffing the patent office?
So to the former, I don't think so. This is one of the sort of nice things about the patent office is it at least today, it's entirely self-funded through patent fees. Tends to just sort of operate on its own without a lot of political interference. There are changes resulting from staffing. So there's been some work in the patent literature looking at patent issue rates. They decline when the patent examiners sort of get really backlogged, and then they hire a few more examiners, and the rates go up. Sort of an administrative cycle. One of the nice things about this design is we've got these state laws going into effect at different times, so I'm less worried about that really being a major confounder.
So is there any way to get at the quality of patents, not just the quantity of patents, right? I mean, I can imagine kind of a silly story, right, where you have a couple of creative people who are well lubricated, right, and come up with an idea to patent. And the idea really is pretty trivial, but they're going to follow through with it, right? And get that patent on the books. And it doesn't really matter, right?
I don't think that's a silly idea at all, to be honest. I had similar thoughts. So in general, yes, there are things we can do to think about the quality of patents. I don't know how in the weeds we'd like to get, but a very short answer is all of our data on patent quality is itself higher quality for more recent patents. For instance, one of the most common ways we think about measuring patent quality today is to look at citations to a patent. So just like an academic paper, if you publish a patent and it builds on previous inventions, you're required by law to cite those in the patent. And even if you don't, as the patent examiner is reviewing your application, they will list any prior patents that they've used. So we can look at backward citations and get a proxy for patent quality. The issue for the historian is these only begin to be published in 1947. And while there are a number of patents that are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old that still get cited, there's far more that do not. So, using forward citations as a measure of quality in a historical setting tends to give you variation only in the extreme right tail of quality. So I've looked at that. I've looked at citations. You can look like citation weighting patent counts. I think you find basically results similar to what we find, any sort of controls for citations just makes things noisy. And there are other rough proxies for patent quality. You can look at for instance, the patent claims are the part of the patent that actually set out the legal boundaries of the invention. So you can do some things with how the claims are constructed. The idea being like a shorter claim actually gives you a broader range of protection because you're putting fewer stipulations on and fewer conditions on what the patent covers. So you can think about like claim length. Do we tend to see, on average, patent claims get shorter if we think patent quality improves after prohibition, or longer if patent quality decreases? And we don't really see anything. But again, all of these are quite noisy. So I don't see any differences in quality, but I would not be comfortable saying there are definitely no changes.
Is there any way to capture the revenue stream from a patent over time?
Not really. Especially not for patents that don't issue to firms. If it issues to a corporation, maybe there's some revenue trail. It's very difficult, unfortunately.
So I have a few other questions, and they're really kind of just getting at various things. So one of the things I was thinking about was, so one of the reasons I picked Max to discuss this paper is he has taught, maybe still teaches, a course on prohibition. And we've talked at conferences about things. One of the things that he's always been interested in, but has not studied or did not study a few years ago, I don't know if he's gotten to it, but the anti-saloon leagues, right? And you were a big fan of that being a really important interest group early in our history that has not been studied. And I was just wondering to what extent you might, can you get the data on where they're located? Can you map the data? And could you see them as an alternative to saloons, as a social gathering place? So one of the things that you might think about is, you have these two groups of places, right? And you take away one locale where people can get together and, among other things, discuss ideas. And maybe in this other locale, you had a substitute forming over time. And that substitute is not changed at all, right? You have something growing in one of the two groups of places while something is being taken away in the other, right? It might not change the results, but it would be an interesting part of the story, perhaps, right? And that goes to a second question, right, that's related to this. And maybe this is more just kind of an off-the-cuff kind of thing, but is there a type of person who innovates and creates, right? Is there someone who, is the type of person who's creative in such a way that's going to do something that's going to lead to getting a patent? Are they more or less likely going to gravitate to a certain type of social group, right? Are they just never going to enter a saloon at all? So it's not important to them whether it exists or not, right? And they may be more inclined to talk to people in their anti-saloon league meetings or, after church or what have you. So these are two questions that are just kind of 2 points that maybe are in search of a question. I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking there.
Yeah, I think, almost certainly there are characteristics that inventors have on average more than other people or less than other people. What makes it such an interesting topic to study, I think, is that almost surely those differences exist, but I'm not sure we have a lot of data on, what they are, which presents, of course, a great opportunity. So I mentioned a couple times some of my work linking inventors to the census. That's just sort of at a very basic level. Now we can say something about demographics and occupation and immigration status. Even that has been sort of beyond what we knew until just a few years ago. I should say, when you see a patent record, the only thing the PTO knows about who this person is their name and their location. So anything about the background of these people, we don't know from the patent record. You've got to pull in some other data and link it with the patent record to discover more about who these folks are. So I sort of think, as a literature, we're at the point where I can say on average, demographically, what does an inventor look like? But like psychologically and in terms of their interests and characteristics, I don't think we're there yet. that being said, I think we sort of suspect these people are, well, we know they're on average more educated, probably, maybe higher IQ, although it's not clear whether sort of to what extent intelligence or creativity, to what extent those things are innate versus taught for invention. Probably more curious, probably open to ideas, probably willing to take risks. It's hard to quantify these things. But the other thing I will say is that there's so many people who invent at any given time in the US that almost surely there's a distribution of characteristics. You think about our colleagues in academia, there's some people who would never be seen at the bar, and there's some people who love to go out after every seminar and talk about the talk. I think there's certainly variation. So there's enough people in both camps. There's surely some who would go out drinking. I'm positive there are some who are committed dries. Can't think of examples off the top of my head of inventors, but certainly academics and things like that. You can find people on both sides. So there's a mix.
Okay. So I had a couple of questions that were probably in keeping with some of the robustness checks, right? And thinking about it in those terms. So you have a set of wet counties, a set of dry counties, right? Always wet, always dry. Is it possible to think about that set of always wet counties in two groups? And those would be controlled by Democrats versus controlled by Republicans, as a way to examine the enforcement issue after Prohibition starts. So would you expect, if you broke that set of counties into politically controlled groups, would you expect ex ante that there would be a difference between them after Prohibition starts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a particularly strong prior. Maybe. That's a great question.
Now you don't. I mean, clearly there's a lot of empty space in your map, right? I mean, there are not that many places, but there's probably enough that you can examine that question.
Yeah,
at least to some degree.
Sure. And we can fill in that map a bit if we're willing to willing to loosen some of these restrictions on how consistently wet versus how consistently dry was a place. Where state laws passed by statute rather than referendum, things like that. And results that tend to be robust across all of these, although I think maybe less internally consistent or internally valid.
I mean, by 1920 or thereabouts, or the second decade of the 20th century, are there still Republican-controlled major cities in the country? Is Philadelphia still controlled by Republicans by that time?
You guys would know far better than I am. I couldn't say. That's a good question.
I mean, it's been a long time since I read any of this. Is like Jessica Trunstein's work, right? Or maybe her first book. But there were some Republican machine cities, for example. I don't know if they've disappeared by this time or not. But that just got me to thinking about this particular question. So on the other side, right, I'm thinking about cities. Any political scientist will always ask you, is there a South effect here, right? Is there something different about the South, right? And you do have some South, right, in your map. And even some parts of the South are wet, right? I think North Carolina, I noticed in your map, there are a couple counties in the wet category, maybe, of North Carolina.
Yeah, it's been, I'll have to confess, it's been a little while since I've done a particular cut. I don't know, Max, if you remember if it's in an appendix somewhere. I don't remember anything jumping out. You can also look, so to your question of Republican-controlled cities, one thing I have done is do big population versus small population. You can do the same thing, urbanized versus not urbanized. And results are, to me, surprisingly consistent across the specifications. Again, likewise, I don't remember anything jarring jumping out South versus non-South or by census region. I'm sure the point estimates are different by a little bit over region, but I think the story is consistent. I would have to double check.
So you could argue that the counties that you throw out potentially, right, could be the most creative counties, right, because they're bouncing back and forth, or they're open to change, right?
Yeah, it's possible. What I will say is, we talked about some of these advances in the new diff literature earlier. What makes these comparison counties what makes these counties that switch hard to think about is we think there's dynamic effects from prohibition. Let's suppose even the places that self-impose prohibition, if we thought there was a drop and then a recovery, if you're not sure where they are in that cycle, it makes it hard to interpret the coefficients when you're comparing some of these previously wet counties to these controls that, are either declining or rising in levels of patenting as a result of this heterogeneous treatment effect over time. So econometrically or empirically, I think it makes it hard to think about that. Point. I interrupted you. I apologize.
No.
They could be absolutely creative in the sense that they're the ones actually taking a risk to change the local policy.
I mean, if you were asked if you were asked by someone to come up with some empirics that would show creativity in the United States by county level in 1900, would there be anything that an economic historian could point to?
I think of patents as
exactly. Right?
Creativity. You could certainly accuse me of, when all of your data is a patent hammer, everything starts to look like a patent nail. I don't know if systematic data on things like, book publishing or music publishing or sort of creative fields.
College graduates, something like that?
I would be less comfortable with something like that for a couple of reasons. I guess, first of all, you tend to get college graduates close to where you get colleges. I have some other works on the establishment of colleges, and it's quite the process to get a school created. And the places that get a college look quite different from the places that don't. For a lot of reasons. It could be the local community is more open to new ideas, so you could be proxying for that. It could also be, it was a politically desirable location for some reason, or it's geographically central to the state. The other thing with college graduates is, depending on the type of institution and exactly the time period, whether these are people who we'd expect to be unusually creative, or whether these are people who we, expected to be particularly good at memorizing Greek. I'm not sure those are correlated. So we'd have to think a little bit about type of institution, exactly what the curricula is, things like that. I think that's harder to think about.
So going back to the South thing again, right? So another thing that we had in the years prior to the period that you're looking at was another set of laws that might dampen innovation, and that's any kind of segregation laws, right? Jim Crow laws. Does that impact here at all?
So I haven't looked specifically at how the timing of the state prohibition laws varies with adoption of Jim Crow laws. That's a good thing to put on the docket.
I want to say Cook maybe has looked at something.
Yeah. There's data on the rollout of Jim Crow laws for sure. It's just how coincident is it with the prohibition laws, I think is the question. One thing I have done is looked at, obviously, totally the opposite direction in a different group, but I've looked at women's suffrage laws. The thinking there being women in particular tend to be quite opposed to the saloon for reasons we talked about already. And again, whether you look at places where the prohibition law goes into effect before women's suffrage or vice versa, we have several states where it's each ways. It doesn't make a difference in terms of the effect that we see. I suspect that would be the case with Jim Crow as well, particularly because I don't remember the South being notably different from the rest of the country, but it's a good idea. It's worth looking into.
Yeah. One thing about Jim Crow is that, it does extend to the border states. So it incorporates, Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and Oklahoma and West Virginia and a few others.
The other thing that would be interesting, Trayvon Logan and John Parman have fantastic data on residential segregation. So, specifically our houses, they're more of a mix of like houses door to door than we would expect. So I don't know, you could probably tell a story where people live very close together, and then you have a third place close by. It's easier for some of that mixing to happen. Versus if you live in a very segregated, residentially segregated town, they're going to separate third places and things like that. So that might be an avenue to think about this as well.
And last question. This is kind of a real Hail Mary, but there's no reason why the 18th Amendment would have displaced creative people, right, to other areas. It's kind of silly, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, it affects the entire country.
Yeah.
With the national amendments, there's no reason to pack up and move.
But it does affect some industries, right? And some people would be out of work, right? Would they be more inclined? Would they be the people who are out of work because of that? Are they disproportionately more creative? And would they disproportionately be inclined to move to other areas? Maybe to dry counties for some reason.
Yeah, it's not that I know. It's not to say that such an effect couldn't be there.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not a literature I know particularly well, but I would not be surprised if out of work people are more geographically mobile because you're moving to find the opportunity. It's plausible.
Yeah.
Again, in my context in particular, I can sort of look at these population flows, and it doesn't, over the time period I see, so this is not federal Prohibition amendment, this is after the state laws, I don't see more people leaving the counties that wanted to be wet, or more people coming into the counties that wanted to be wet, or into the counties that were dry. So to the extent I can sort of look at the gross flows, it doesn't look like that's happening over the short time period I look at. These state laws and the federal laws are in place for so long that it's possible you might see some longer term shifts in population. It's a little bit beyond what I was trying to look at here. We're really trying to think about these short run dynamics from disrupting the social network, where I think a lot of these effects happen pretty quickly.
Okay, that's all I have. Max, any questions pop up while I was ranting here?
No, nothing else from me. I think it's really hard to think about what would cause sorting here that would produce these effects, especially in the short term. I mean, these are immediate, or as immediate, I think, as a patent can be, right? The year later kind of thing. I wouldn't think that there'd be enough mobility to change anything or any sort of sorting, that would contribute to that in the short term. And the fact that they recover it says that people probably aren't moving, right? These same people who are innovative before get disrupted in how they're innovating, but then find new ways to compensate.
Yeah, you would need a story where like the people who really like the bar, now that the bar is gone, they move out, but they're almost exactly replaced one for one by people who would have lived in the town before, except it was wet. I do find that a bit at surface level implausible, but it's just not what you see looking at the population flows in the census.
So I'd asked you about sort of quality of patents, and that might be hard to get at. Are there categories of patents that you could break your sample into?
There are. This is where it gets a little bit. I need to be a little bit careful how I describe this. It was maybe a bit frustrating to me trying to cut the data this way, in that if you look at different patent classes, so every time you file a patent, the patent office will classify it into a technology class, basically, that decides what examiner does it go to. So the examiners know, a particular area of technology very well. So you could think about cutting these results by technology classes. And when you do that, you find actually like fairly precisely zero differences across broad technology classes. So it makes it tough because like county by county, I can see that after places that are affected by prohibition, they're less likely to patent the same narrow technology classes they were working in before, but they don't seem to be shifting in any sort of systematic direction. It's not like on average after prohibition, we see fewer mechanical patents and more electrical patents. We just see different stuff. County by county, we're just doing different things, but not in any sort of consistent pattern across the country. So I see that as very consistent with, as we're changing the social network, any given person is being exposed to somebody new than they were before. And then those people are just going to be doing, we get different combinations and hence different technology classes, but not in a way that's particularly predictable. So a lot of the ways you could think about cutting technology classes just don't show much.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking a little bit, in political science, one of the things that we focus a lot on are laws, right? How many laws does Congress pass? And we start to think about, how many of them are major laws? Right. And should we think of the aggregate number of laws as being important when we think of something like the effects of polarization on those laws? So there's lots of parallels in the way that kind of, some of the stuff that Max and I kind of have done and what you're doing in terms of, your dependent variable and maybe some of the same sorts of questions that you might get asked about these sorts of things. But I find this really interesting. I like the topic, both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, right? This notion of patents, which I didn't know a whole lot about before either, as well as, the county level dynamics that are going on in the country at this time, right? Wet versus dry. And it's a fun time in American history, for sure. American political history, American economic history. So we're about at time. And before my dogs really start getting howly downstairs, I want to thank you, Mike, for spending part of your afternoon with us and showing us your work. And thanks to Max for also spending part of his day and being willing to provide his great comments and discussion as always. And it was a great workshop. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm always glad when I can bring together people from different social science disciplines, right? The economics and economic historians, political scientists, and people who have common interest across those two groups. So a real win today for us all and for social science in general.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a blast, a lot of fun. I appreciate all the questions. I think they're going to hopefully lead to a stronger paper. So thank you.
Excellent. And I will let both of you know when we go live. This will go up on YouTube in probably the next week. So I'll send you the links so that you can pass them on as you so desire. And Mike, you were not on Twitter, right? I looked for you on Twitter and I did not see you on Twitter.
I'm not particularly active, I think. So I'll send that to you if I can.
Okay, that way I can kind of link you in when I find it. But okay, so thanks again. And as always, thanks to Ann Johnson at the Bedrosian Center for helping me do all of these things. And for all those people out there listening in, have a good afternoon, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks.